Coming up next, it's the Flintstones on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's more of the Flintstones on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's a Flintstones Christmas Carol on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Looney Tunes on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's more Looney Tunes on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Baby Looney Tunes on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's more of the Looney Tunes show on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Tom and Jerry on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's more Tom and Jerry on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Tom and Jerry Tales on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's more Tom and Jerry Tales on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Tom and Jerry's Giant Adventure on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo, Where Are You? On Boomerang. Coming up next, it's more Scooby-Doo, Where Are You? On Boomerang. Coming up next, it's more What's New, Scooby-Doo? On Boomerang. Coming up next, it's a pup named Scooby-Doo on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's more a pup named Scooby-Doo on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's the new Scooby-Doo movies on Boomerang. Next, it's Scooby-Doo Mystery Incorporated on Boomerang. Next, it's more Scooby-Doo Mystery Incorporated on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo Pirates Ahoy on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's the Jetsons on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's more the Jetsons on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's the Smurfs on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Dexter's Laboratory on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's more Dexter's Laboratory on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's the Powerpuff Girls on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's more of the Powerpuff Girls on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends on Boomerang. Next, it's more Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's the Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's more the Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy on Boomerang. Next, it's Billy and Mandy, Wrath of the Spider Queen on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Codename Kids Next Door on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's more Codename Kids Next Door on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Ed, Edd and Eddy on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's more Ed, Edd and Eddy on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Ed, Edd and Eddy's Boo-Ha-Ha on Boomerang. Coming up next, Courage the Cowardly Dog on Boomerang. Coming up next, more Courage the Cowardly Dog on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Chowder on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's more Chowder on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Teen Titans Go on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's more Teen Titans Go on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Nunchucks on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's a new Nunchucks on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's a new Garage Band on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Sylvester and Tweety Mysteries on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's the premiere of Wabbit on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Be Cool, Scooby-Doo on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Bunnicula on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's more Bunnicula on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's more of the Tom and Jerry Show on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Pink Panther and Pals on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's the Garfield Show on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's more of the Garfield Show on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's the new Garfield Show on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's new Shaun the Sheep on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's new Sonic Boom on Boomerang. next, it's the new series Peanuts on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Grizzy and the Lemmings on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's a new Grizzy and the Lemmings on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's more the Powerpuff Girls on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Uncle Grandpa on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's more Uncle Grandpa on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's a new Amazing World of Gumball on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's more OKKO, Let's Be Heroes on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Johnny Test on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Pokemon on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Pokemon Movie 11, Giratina and the Sky Warrior on Boomerang.